Okay, so we're going to look at this question here from a mistakes perspective. So if we were working on this question, something I might see you guys do a lot as students is you say something like 3x squared plus 2x equals 1, and then you would do something like try to factor on the left-hand side, which seems like it would be a reasonable thing to do, because you could say something like, well, this number times this number equals 1, which is, yeah, sure, that's true, but which set of numbers are we going to take? Because like 1 times 1 is 1, but 1/2 times 2 is 1, and 3 times a third is 1, and dot, 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 right? Like this goes on for infinity. So we can't decide which pairing it is algebraically, which means like my pen and my paper, which pair makes this equal 1. So instead, we can say this doesn't work for us algebraically. No algebra. Okay, not that way. But if we wanted to, we could do something like this. We could say this equation right here, this is that quadratic we were looking at, and 1, well, in fact they do intersect, and the pair that we would work is -1 and 0.3333, or a third. So basically that means like if x is -1 or if x is 1/3 and we plug those into the equation, we get 1. Either one of those would work as our x. But we can't do that by hand. It's not something that is easy to work with. So instead, oops, that's not the one I want. Instead, what we do is we say, well, this is no bueno. So we're going to back up, back all the way up, just to our original equation, which was 3x squared plus 2x equals 1. And instead, we're going to move this over here. Equals 0. And then since this is a trinomial, we can factor it into two binomials, x, 3x minus 1 and x plus 1, and I just jumped ahead through the factoring of that, but if you wanted to factor using the box method, you could say 3x squared minus 1, and then a times c gives me -3, and which pairing of -3 adds to make +2? Well, +3 and -1 does. So +3, -1, again, those are both interchangeable. So then you'd pull your 3x, and then this would be x, which means this has to be 1, and this has to be -1, and then we could put those in. So when I get to here, I can say, what two numbers multiply together to make 0? Well, like it could be 5 times 0, or it could be 8 billion times 0, or maybe it's 0 times 0. But the point is that one of these numbers has to be 0, which allows us to lock down what's going on. So either this is 0, or this is 0, or they're both 0. So we just operate under, well, if either one of these components is 0, if 3x minus 1 equals 0, then the whole thing equals 0. And if x plus 1 equals 0, then the whole thing equals 0, which allows us to algebraically manipulate this and solve our equation. So we would get 3x equals 1, and x equals -1, and then x equals a third, and x still is just -1. So these are our two values. If y is 0, if the output is 0, then these are our two inputs, which, if we go back to our original graph we were looking at, we can say, you know, if this, instead of being, there they are again, if instead of being that, if it were 3x squared plus 2x minus 1, well, where does that intersect 0? Well, it intersects 0 at -1 and a third, just like these intersected at -1 and a third. So algebraically, we could only make this one work, but because this has graphing software and they're solving for the intersection of these two things, the graphing software was able to come up with the solution to our earlier equation, but we as hand, pen, and pencil operators are only going to be able to work through this kind where it's equal to 0. So anytime you see a quadratic that begins as something that is not equal to 0, the first thing you do, always, 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 is make it so it equals 0. And the reason is we can work with 0. 0 is a really powerful tool. So anytime you do this, remember this is the takeaway here. Anytime you have a quadratic where you have a square and you have a linear and you have a constant, you have to shift everything to one side of the equation and make it equal to 0. Because if we have two numbers multiplying together and it's not equal to 0, there's an infinite number of answers, pen and paper. But if we have this and it's equal to 0, well then we know one or the other of them, or possibly both of them, are 0. So we can force the solution using pencil and paper. So be aware, big idea.